Good morning, everyone. I am pleased to introduce Ms. Shannon Van Sant, documentary filmmaker. Shannon graduated from Wellesley in 1999 with a degree in political science and was also instrumental in founding Wellesley College Television. She has reported throughout Africa and Asia for CBS News, The Economist, and PBS NewsHour. In 2011, her work was recognized by Amnesty International for Best Human Rights Documentary. She has also received recognition from the Foreign Correspondents Club of Hong Kong. Shannon's stories have covered Chinese investment in Zambia, Uganda, South Sudan, South Africa, and the Comoros, as well as the hunt by U.S. forces for Ugandan warlord Joseph Kony. In 2011, she filmed the journey of North Korean refugees escaping through China and Southeast Asia. Previously, Shannon spent 2 years as a documentary filmmaker for CCTV, China's state-run television, where she filmed 11 documentaries on Chinese government policies. Her work for American and Chinese broadcast networks has taken her to 20 of China's 33 provinces. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Shannon Van Sant.
Thank you very much for the introduction. So I'm going to first ask all of y'all a question. I'm going to pose a hypothetical scenario, and it will give you some insight into my experiences in China over the last several years. And if I'm not speaking loud enough, just let me know. My voice can be a bit quiet. So imagine you're a foreign correspondent in China. This has been your lifelong dream since you were a teenager. And you travel to China, and CCTV, Chinese state-run television, offers you an incredible opportunity. They say you can come and work for them for 2 years, and you'll film stories about government policy all across the country. You'll travel extensively throughout the country and really get an immersive experience in China. You'll immerse yourself in the lives of the people that you're interviewing, but also as well in the lives of the government officials that you'll be spending time with. The catch of this job offer is that CCTV is, of course, run by the government. It's funded by the Chinese government. Your colleagues, who are mostly members of the Communist Party, see themselves as journalists on the one hand and as government representatives on the other. So your work is this kind of baffling mix of working with people who are extremely loyal to China, but also very passionate about journalism and what it means to tell stories and to try to tell the truth. And you know that your work will be censored. But you take this opportunity because it's an incredible chance to learn and to explore China. And just imagine as well, as you're traveling, you're meeting these government officials, you're interviewing farmers and healthcare workers and business people throughout the country in places like Sichuan and Chongqing and Shanxi province. Imagine another layer of that experience, which is corruption. And while you're there at CCTV, you see a lot of corruption. Government officials offer you envelopes of cash. They don't do so with any explicit directive, but they do it just to form good relationships with you, as a gesture of goodwill. I want to be friends, let's form a relationship, a connection. So you receive envelopes of cash, or people try to give you this money. You see your colleagues accepting money for stories and making a lot of money in some cases off of their position as reporters for government-run television. And you also see your boss, one of your direct supervisors, goes missing for several months because he is under internal investigation at CCTV for corruption. And he's gone, for several months. So you see this all around you. Okay, so fast forward several years ahead of that experience at CCTV. You're still in China. Now you're an independent reporter and documentary filmmaker, and you're reporting primarily for American media or sometimes European media. And this independence allows you the freedom to do stories that you most believe in. Now you're free of the censorship of CCTV, but you're also free of the directives of some American news organizations who want to focus on certain kinds of stories in a certain way. You can do stories the way you want to do them about the issues you care about most. And let's say in this position, while you're an independent reporter and documentary filmmaker, China's president, Xi Jinping, launches a wide-ranging crackdown on corruption. And several of your former colleagues at CCTV are arrested, including one of your friends who was a prominent news anchor. And you're watching this happen. It's disturbing. And it brings this whole issue of corruption in China and all the stories you read about every day. It comes to affect your intimate circle of acquaintances and associates and friends. So you're there, and a leading American newspaper asks you to write an article about your experiences at CCTV. They're covering this crackdown on corruption aggressively. You were one of the few people who has firsthand knowledge of what it's like to work in state-run media. You have firsthand experience of the corruption that you witnessed. And they want you to write an article about that, about the things that you have seen. You know that if you write an article, it will provide valuable context for the world about this issue of corruption within state media and about President Xi Jinping's goals and the very real problems in media right now in China. So you know that it would be of value to this story. But you also know that if you write this story, it could create a lot of controversy. CCTV could cut all ties with you forever. It could endanger your visa in China. And this is a place where you've built your career, a place that you really love. So what would you do? Would you write the article? You don't have to answer, but I mean, do you have any ideas? Do you do it? See, and the answer is not easy, right? And this is a dilemma that I have faced specifically, but it's an example of many situations that I found myself in China every day as a reporter. And it gives you an example of some of the compromises that we all make to work in China, not just as a journalist, but as any professional, as any individual or human being. It's a tremendous place with a booming economy, a rising world power, and because of that, one of the best tickets to have a big life is to spend some time in China. If you spend some time in Beijing, you're really in the center of things. You're at the forefront of a society that's undergoing profound change. And you're in a position, through your work there, to make a bigger difference in the world than you could perhaps if you spent those years in New York or in some places in the United States. It's a fast-forward ticket to a fascinating life and to a life that has the potential for real impact. But that life has a cost, right? And whether you're in business or in any field, everyone I know who works there has to ask themselves these questions. Do I speak openly about the things that I know to be true? Do I stay silent? What are the costs of those decisions? When is the right time to speak out and to write that article or to have that debate with your colleague? So this is what I'm going to talk about today, and it's born of my own experience as a Wellesley alum in China, a place, of course, with an authoritarian government, and that's changing tremendously all the time. So I think that's just a great example of the dilemmas that we all face. And it's not just in China, but in many developing countries around the world. If you choose to go to Africa, the Middle East, South America, every country is dealing with these issues. And we deal with them in the United States to some extent as well. But of course, China and the decisions that China makes right now impact everybody in the world because of China's rise, because China, in many ways, has made the single largest contribution to humanity over the last few decades, lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And then they're doing that as well in Africa through their huge investments in Africa and to some extent South America. China's moves right now are really impacting the world in some incredible ways. But because China is rising and it's rising so quickly, China is also impacting and shaping the values of this world. This world has been driven by and been led by Western ideals and values for so many decades and centuries. And China now is adding another voice to this global discussion. And in doing so, it's impacting the conversation, impacting the debate about so many different issues, and having this more subtle impact beyond just economic development and the global economy. So these are some things I want you to think about during this talk. At CCTV, not only did I witness a lot of corruption, as I said, I experienced a lot of censorship of my stories. Sometimes the censorship rules were a little bit bizarre. I got in big trouble for using the word privatization in a story about healthcare. So that's one example. A more serious example is one time I was in a Tibetan village in Qinghai province, and I was doing a story on healthcare. And this one man and a family said that we were filming, he said, it started complaining about the healthcare that they were receiving. And my colleagues at CCTV, they said, hold on, back up here. You didn't mean to say that. You didn't mean to say that the healthcare system had problems. What you meant to say was that the healthcare that we are providing you is really good, and that you love these rural healthcare cooperatives. So we stopped filming, he nodded, and we re-recorded the answer. And that happened a lot at CCTV. It happened a lot. So this just gives you an example, and I'm trying to give you a window through my experience of what it's like to be in China right now. So these sort of ethical questions I faced at CCTV every day, but I felt like the experience was worth it. The experience of being able to travel so much through China, learn learn about the perspective specifically of the government, and creating these stories that tended to be forms of propaganda. It was a necessary cost to my desire to learn deeply about the country. And but it came with a cost of self-censorship, right? Which is debatable. You could say that's an unethical decision that I made. So a couple of months after I left CCTV, I began making my own documentaries. And I went into that process, with an open mind. I just wanted to report in China. I wanted to be there during the Olympics. It was an incredibly exciting time to be in Beijing. And I started researching a broad range of stories. And one story I wanted to do, or was looking at doing, was on China's mental health care system. And as part of my research for that film, I interviewed a Western psychiatrist who had worked in China for about 20 or 30 years. He had a great firsthand knowledge of the changes in mental health care in China. So he told me about the history there, the improvements that China was making. But he said to me at the end of our phone interview and our call, which was just for research at that point, he said, I'll talk with you about anything on camera. But one thing I won't talk with you about is the imprisonment of protesters and petitioners in China's psychiatric hospitals. He said, it's not happening, and I don't have any knowledge of it. I've never seen it, and I'm not going to talk with you about it. So, of course, what did my next story focus on? That's what my story was about. And so what I did was I began researching this topic in depth, and I managed to make contact with a man in Wuhan at the time. It was a one-man NGO, and I don't know why he cared so passionately about this particular issue, but he did. And he had kept files of hundreds of people across the country who had been kept in a mental health care facility, declared insane, for a variety of reasons. Sometimes they got in a dispute with their family over inheritance. Sometimes it was because they were protesting a certain issue and the local authorities wanted to quiet them and silence them. So a wide variety of issues. So I'm going to play a video of that story now. And I want you to pay close attention to a professor who appears in the middle and towards the end of the story. His name is Tung Biao. And just look out for his interview.
Next tonight, a diagnosis of mental illness for political dissidents in China. Special correspondent Shannon Van Sant has our Global Health Unit story. She has reported from China for our PBS colleagues at the Nightly Business Report, among other programs.
Qing Xingang is a long way from home. He has traveled from Wuhan, 700 miles away in central China, to Beijing, where he stays in this one-room shack. Every morning, he goes to government offices, pleading for help.
I strongly ask Hu Jintao and the Chinese Communist Party Central Committee to punish corruption. Save Chinese people, ordinary people, the weak in society. Save China. I'm not only standing on my own ground, I speak for thousands of people who get persecuted as mentally ill patients.
A former officer in the People's Liberation Army, Qing has been forcibly hospitalized 6 times, accused of being mentally ill. He says he's not the only one with grievances who's been treated that way.
The first time, the diagnosis was acute stress disorder. The second time was paranoid schizophrenia. The third time, just like all the other petitioners, doctors diagnosed me with paranoid psychosis.
Qing's journey began when he came to Beijing to complain about corruption in the factory he worked in. He was a petitioner, one of thousands who come here to seek redress from the central Chinese government for various wrongs, from land seizures to mistreatment by police. Once in the capital, they stay in makeshift petitioners' villages like this one. China's petitioning system dates back to the Ming Dynasty 700 years ago, when people appealed for help from the imperial court if they had problems with local officials.
She wants to give you her material.
When I visited this neighborhood, petitioners quickly approached, telling me their stories. Within minutes, I was spotted by security officers who marched me out of the neighborhood. When I tried to leave, people surrounded my taxi cab, showing me copies of their petitions.
China's emphasis on social harmony provides incentive for petitioners to press for justice, but it also sets the stage for their persecution. That's because petitioners know that Chinese officials in the central government take unrest in local communities seriously. But the local officials who are being complained about will often seek retribution or try to stop people from petitioning in the first place.
Tang Biao, a professor at the University of Politics and Law in Beijing, says the system itself creates these kinds of problems. He runs an NGO to provide legal aid to petitioners.
From the top down, the petitioning situation is an assessing index for the officials on the political achievements. If there are many petitioners coming to Beijing from a place, then it will affect the local officials on their promotions and bonuses.
For his work, Tang Biao had his lawyer's license and passport taken away. After this interview, Chinese authorities shut down Tang Biao's NGO, and police detained 2 of his colleagues. Despite the risk, Tang said he will continue his work. I traveled to Wuhan to talk with another Chinese activist, Liu Feiyue, but he was under house arrest. Liu heads an NGO that is currently following 100 cases of wrongful psychiatric detention. Over the last 3 years, he says he knows of 500 more whistleblowers and protesters who have been detained in mental hospitals. Robin Monroe, who has extensively researched psychiatric detention in China and written 2 books on the topic, thinks the practice is widespread.
China's experience in this area is far more serious and extensive than any other country.
Monroe, who is based in Hong Kong, believes that since there are no national mental health laws protecting the rights of people who have been compulsorily hospitalized, but there are rules limiting arbitrary arrest, hospitals are becoming a convenient means of silencing protesters.
Once diagnosed in this way as dangerously mentally ill, citizens have no rights. They have no legal right to see a lawyer, no legal right to be brought before a judge so that a judicial determination can be made.
The Chinese press, including the Beijing News, has reported on the hospitalizations. The story was picked up by the state's official press agency, the People's Daily, and Sina.com, where it drew 23,000 comments. Such coverage in Chinese newspapers could imply there is central government support for preventing wrongful psychiatric detention by local officials. China's Ministry of Health denied requests for an interview, but sent a list of relevant regulations on treatment of the mentally ill, which said, in part, the diagnosis of psychiatric disease is according to the Chinese Mental Disorder Category and Diagnosis Standard 3rd Edition, approved by Chinese Medical Association and referring to the related Standards of International Disease Diagnosis Category. When asked at a press conference about the increasing numbers of protesters being put in mental hospitals, the spokesperson for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said,
"It's the first time for me to hear the situation you addressed. I don't know about the situation of psychiatric hospitals, but please believe the related Chinese governmental departments conduct administration according to law."
But in Wuhan, another petitioner, Hu Guohong, said he has been forcibly hospitalized in mental institutions 4 times, and that he and his wife, Cheng Shui, have been warned repeatedly by local officials to stop petitioning.
They said, "We don't allow you to go petitioning to the upper levels. If you do that, we will beat you to death."
Since the couple is under police surveillance, I met them in a hotel room late at night. They showed me a list with thumbprint signatures of fellow petitioners who have been detained in Wuhan psychiatric hospitals. Who said when he complained about being owed back pay for his work constructing railroad cars, he was beaten by the factory's security team. After Hu demanded compensation for his injuries, police put him in the Wuhan Hong psychiatric hospital for 3 days. Since then, doctors have diagnosed him with schizophrenia and paranoia. Police often arrest him before major events, as they did before the Olympics.
They gave me 1 and then 2 yellow pills every day. They said they would set me free after the Olympics. They told me to be nice. But after the Olympics and during the Paralympics, they still held me. At the end of September, I escaped. They caught me, and the next day, they gave me electric shocks.
The shocks were administered with electrified needles that pierced the feet, the palms of his hands, and his temples.
The electric shocks continued for 2 hours of high voltage.
He's been detained twice since then, including just after I interviewed him, which was 5 days before the anniversary of the government's crackdown in Tiananmen Square. He was kept in a hospital for 12 days.
Whenever there's a crackdown of some kind going on in the country, a political crackdown, or the Olympics are coming up, a huge international event, then the police will be instructed to go out and preemptively detain anyone who might stage an embarrassing incident to the government in the run-up to these crucial events. And people on the list who are mentally ill or allegedly mentally ill are among the first people that will be preemptively detained.
Despite the dangers, many petitioners refuse to give up. Qing Qingang says he'll stay in Beijing as long as he can, petitioning for help.
I have been to Beijing 133 times. I have no other way. My family is destroyed. I wander the streets of Beijing. I am a 60-year-old man begging for food and asking the government for justice, to right a wrong.
But he expects to be arrested by the end of the summer, before the anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China on October 1st.
And since that report was produced, the Chinese government has cracked down further on activists. For the first time, they've issued a regulation banning petitioners from traveling to Beijing.
I show you that story for a number of reasons. Partly, as I explained to you my experience and my story in China, for me that story was a pivotal point in my life, in my career. Because I filmed a much longer version of that story that was turned into a 30-minute documentary. So that's just a portion of the story that I reported. But as a documentary filmmaker, unlike some other journalists, I spend months and months and months with the people that I'm interviewing, filming them. So just like I did with CCTV, immersing myself in the lives of my colleagues and the government officials that we were spending a lot of time with in many parts of the country, for this story and the people that you saw that I interviewed, I spent months with them. And for me, it was a very, I would say, arresting experience. It really shook me. And I was very upset by the end of the story. So I say that because it changed my life in China, but also my work as a journalist. And I want to point out that professor, Tang Biao, he said off camera, in addition to some of the pressures that he said he faced on camera that we included in the story, off camera he said he was pressured by his university to stop his activism and stop speaking out He's now a fellow or a visiting scholar at Harvard University. I just spoke with him a couple of weeks ago. He's very happy that I'm giving this talk here today. So he faced a lot of hardship. He was kidnapped, tortured, and now he's in the States. But more importantly, for the purposes of this talk here today, he was pressured by his university to stop what he was doing. So I say that partly because I just want to touch on it briefly, but there's been this issue and this controversy surrounding Wellesley's partnership with Peking University. And about a year and a half ago, Wellesley announced this partnership through this fabulous event in Beijing that included very powerful women, both from the States and China. And then shortly after the partnership was announced, there was this professor at Peking, Xia Yeliang, who said he was fired for his political beliefs from Peking. And then after that, more than 100 faculty here at Wellesley signed a letter asking Wellesley to reconsider its partnership with Peking because of these questions over academic freedom. And from what I understand, that partnership is still in question. I don't know if it's going to go forward. If it does not go forward, that's going to be a real loss. I think it's a real shame, both for the women of Peking and the people here. It's a great collaboration. But it also, that collaboration highlights these challenges to working with China, which is when you bring up an issue like academic freedom, an issue that in some ways, at least from an American perspective, has to be debated and has to be looked at squarely. What you do is you risk a very valuable partnership in China. And there's no right answer in that situation. And like I said, this is a question with many of my stories that I ask every day. Is it worth it to report this story when, in doing so, you could risk the loss of so many things that are both valuable to yourself personally, but valuable professionally? And so that the status of Wellesley's partnership with Peking, I think, brings that issue to the fore. Tang Biao, that professor in that story, he faces the same pressures we all do if we choose to work in China. Do we keep our heads down, or do we campaign for and talk openly about the things we know are true and are happening, and about the things we know are right and just? And Tang Biao, and like many activists like him, they've seen so many difficult things firsthand, they can't stay silent anymore. And of course, the consequences that he faces as a Chinese national are incredibly severe. The worst that will ever happen to me is I get kicked out of China, right? But that pales in comparison to what could happen to him and other people like him. So, like many journalists I know, as a journalist, we get a front-hand seat to many things in China and many parts of the world, including the United States. And some of the things we see are the worst aspects of those societies, right? And there are problems in every society in the world. And that's why some of the reporting on China is so aggressive, I think, and can be so critical. But I have to say that PBS story, it really changed me, because at CCTV, I was willing to remain quiet about things in exchange for this incredible experience. And that was a great decision. But the people in that report and many others I filed, they haunt me. They called me for months afterwards asking me for help. And of course I can't offer them any help. But all I could do was say, I will report this story and I will tell your story. And through my reporting, I will offer you kind of proof of your existence, because you will no longer live in anonymity. There will be a historical record that you lived, and this was your experience during this chapter in China's history, right? You will probably be, I didn't say this, but you'll probably be impoverished for the rest of your life, and you will encounter great difficulties for the rest of your life, and I can't change that. But this will be a proof of your experience, and that your life mattered, and that these terrible things you're going through matter, and that somebody somewhere is paying attention. So that's all I could give them. But it changed me from somebody who cannot remain quiet, because there's so many people in this world, in every society, including the United States, who don't have a voice, and who really depend on people like us as Wellesley grads, as the elite of our country. And such privileged women. They depend on us to offer them a lift up and offer them a voice. So during my time in China, I changed in those ways. But as I changed over the past 8 years in Beijing, China has also changed, especially under the current leadership. And as China's power has grown, over the last couple of years, the pressure to self-censor has also grown tremendously. This is true in academia. Peking University last year urged its students and staff to wage a resolute struggle against speech challenging the party's core values. It said it had improved a 24-hour online monitoring system to curb negative speech. Some Chinese universities have recently installed video cameras in their classrooms. They haven't stated the reason for that, but that's what they've done. And state-run media has sent reporters to various classrooms across the country and run articles critical of professors who have been teaching things that they feel are against Communist Party values and ideals. This crackdown, this pressure to self-censor, of course, affects journalists. Last year, China forbade journalists and news organizations from initiating critical reporting that has not been approved. And it has forbidden Chinese reporters from passing information to Western reporters like myself. A number of Chinese journalists have been arrested for a variety of reasons as well over the last 6 months. So that's the situation domestically in China right now. That's the chapter we're in. And the pressure to self-censor, though, has not only grown in China, but it's grown in other parts of the world that I've traveled to. Last year, for CBS News and The Economist, I reported a story on Chinese investment in the Comoros. And I've reported extensively on Chinese investment in Africa. And as you all probably know, China's doing lots of very interesting things in Africa. And in the Comoros, it's a very small island nation north of Madagascar. They're building everything. It's an impoverished country. And China, basically, if you are a Comoran, every aspect of your life is being provided by the Chinese government. They're building roads, schools, hospitals. They're providing free medicine, malaria medicine. They are building a stadium and government buildings, of course, a media center and a power plant. And it's a desperately poor country. And they're transforming the lives of the people who live there in very positive ways. But while I was there, in addition to all of these incredibly positive things that China is doing, local African newspaper reporters in the Comoros told me that Chinese fishing boats over the last couple of years have appeared off the coast. And they are depleting the fish stocks off of the coast of the country. Now, this is a place, to put it in context, where risk advisory firms say that food scarcity is an extreme risk for inspiring social unrest. I mean, people suffer there from malnutrition and lack of food. And these reporters told me, the Comoran reporters, they said these fishing boats are depleting our fish stocks. And we've tried to report stories on it, but we've been told by our editors that the Chinese government has asked the Comoros government to repress these stories and to stop reporting on that. So this provides you an example of how values and the values of great world powers shape our worlds and impact people's lives in all kinds of ways. We see this increasingly as well in some American organizations, and it's something I think we have to watch out for. In December, a Tibetan activist says she posted on Facebook news of self-immolation in Tibet. People in Tibet, of course, have been some people are setting themselves on fire in protest of the Chinese government. And she posted a video about this man's death. And Facebook took it down. Facebook said it was because the video was too graphic. But this woman says that's not the case. She says that they took it down to appease the Chinese government. Mark Zuckerberg recently visited Beijing. He's met with Chinese officials. He's publicly stated he wishes to expand Facebook's presence in China. So that's one potential example of this. In 2013, Bloomberg News, employees of Bloomberg News said that the company curbed an investigative report about Chinese leaders. And they did it because they didn't want to hurt the sales of the company's financial terminals in China. I knew people who were working on that report. And a former Bloomberg editor had this to say about the situation. Business and political power are inextricably linked everywhere. That's especially so in China, where both are largely in the hands of a single unelected political party that forbids the free flow of information and ideas and operates behind a veil of secrecy. Lack of transparency and accountability fuel rampant corruption, human rights abuses, and environmental crimes. As China goes global, those values and practices are in danger of gaining currency elsewhere. I've also come under greater pressure personally. Last year, I should say in 2013, China initially refused to renew my visa because the government said they did not like the questions that I asked at press conferences. And I had to write a letter of explanation of my work and my questions, which I found completely baffling. I mean, how do you explain why you ask certain questions, right? And I knew, even though I knew my visa would probably be renewed, it's still that it was a tremendously uncertain time. And I knew that if it was not renewed, that I'd have to cut ties with this country that's been the source of so much professional and personal growth. It would be a great loss for me. I've also, over the last couple years, come under greater intimidation by Chinese authorities and police. To give you one example, earlier this year I was at a press conference for Malaysia Airlines relatives of the people who were on board the plane that disappeared. It was flying from Malaysia to Beijing. And I think 2/3 of the passengers were Chinese. So we had regular press conferences in Beijing for relatives of the passengers, where Malaysian authorities and airline authorities would update them on the latest information of what happened to that plane. So it was a press conference in a room filled with hundreds of people, mostly family members, probably 50 or 100 journalists, lots of police. And I was sitting in the back of the room working, and this man sat down next to me. He was kind of pudgy, wearing glasses. He was wearing a normal outfit, slacks and a shirt. And he asked me what I was doing. And I said, well, I'm here reporting on this and that and the other. And he said, well, I work for the Entry-Exit Bureau. And I was like, oh. And so I started kind of joking with him. And I said, well, you must have files on all of this, right? And he said, well, I don't have files on you, but the Foreign Ministry does, and we work closely with them. And he said, for example, I visit journalist offices all the time. I've been to Jiangguomen Diplomatic Compound 72144, and that's the office where I work. That's the floor number and the office number where I work. And he mentioned the names of the people in my office. And he said, let me show you a photo album. So he flipped open his phone, like an iPhone or something. And he showed me, the first picture he showed me was a picture of a letter that a New York Times reporter had written the police department that year, thanking them for his visa renewal. And then he flipped to another picture, and it was of this man with the glasses about to hit another man or shove him or something. And he said, this is a picture of me and a Reuters cameraman. This was, I took this picture, somebody took this picture of me and the cameraman outside of the trial of Xu Zhiyong. Xu Zhiyong was a colleague of that man, Teng Biao, and a lawyer and an activist and dissident. And then he flipped to another picture, and it was of this man dragging another man, a Chinese man, by the shoulders, dragging him somewhere. And he said, this is Xu Zhiyong's lawyer. And at this point, of course, I really didn't know what to say. And I said, well, did you hurt him? And he said, no, we don't have to hurt Xu Zhiyong's lawyer. We don't have to hurt him because he is Chinese. He knows the country he lives in, and he doesn't have travel documents, so he can never leave. So in the end, he always obeys us. And then he stood up abruptly and walked away. So this gives you an example of the daily experience of reporters like me in China, right? That form of intimidation and how unpleasant that can be. And it makes it very clear that there are lines that should not be crossed and that there are consequences when you do. I'm going to show you a picture really quick. And this is from another story. This is to show you, I'll tell you the story, but it's to show you that these pressures are not just in China, but you, as a journalist, but I think really as any person who's trying to do good work in the world, you get in all kinds of sticky situations. So this is the picture of me and 3 North Korean refugees. I filmed a documentary a couple of years ago on the issue of North Korean refugees crossing into China. And what they do is they're escaping North Korea. A lot of times it's because of food scarcity. And China won't offer them asylum. If China finds the refugees, usually they deport them back to North Korea. So these refugees have to make their way all the way through China into Southeast Asia, go through Laos to get to Thailand. And in Thailand, they can safely seek asylum. And Thailand will offer them shelter and give them a passageway to South Korea, or give them a place to stay for a temporary period of time before they can apply for residence or asylum in the United States. So I filmed this story, and these tell you a little bit about these three people. The kid over there, his name is Minwoo. He, I think, was 14 when he traveled across. He grew up in an abusive household in North Korea, and his grandmother and his uncle had escaped earlier. His grandmother paid missionaries to go inside the country. Or basically, there's this whole network of brokers and human smugglers, and basically bring him across the border. And so that's what happened. He traveled on his own. These two women, obviously North Korean, they were prostitutes. The woman in the red shirt, I think it was about 16 when I interviewed her. She had spent the last 2 years in a brothel, held in a brothel for 2 years in northeastern China. And she had been, I think, allowed to leave her room once a month for a quick shopping trip. So since the age of 14, about. And that's very common as well. These women will come over and they will get trafficked into the sex trade, or they'll be brought over by people promising them a better job or a better life in China, and then they get into a situation they can't get out of in prostitution. So anyway, so I filmed these three people and some missionaries, some South Korean missionaries in China and in Laos and in Thailand. So I filmed their escape through China. And as I was waiting for them to cross the Mekong River to get to Thailand, it's a very dangerous journey for them, extremely dangerous, because if they get deported back to North Korea, they face possible execution or time in labor camps, not a fun time. I was waiting for them in Thailand, and I received this call. I was filming the documentary independently, but I had done a lot of work for PBS, and I received this call from the PBS NewsHour, and they said, Hillary Clinton's spokesperson is trying to reach you. He urgently wants to talk to you. His name was PJ Crowley. And I said, well, why? And they said, we don't know. So I emailed this man, Mr. Crowley, and he said that he had heard that I was filming a documentary on North Korean refugees, and that he really wanted to talk with me. And so he and some embassy officials set up some emergency meetings, they said, with the US Embassy. It was very urgent. And the moment I landed in Beijing, they wanted to meet with me. So within a couple of hours of returning from this documentary shoot, I had these meetings with the US Embassy. And the embassy wanted to know what I was filming and where I'd been and who I had met. And it was quite a strange experience. This is not a common experience for a reporter. And then after asking me these questions, there was a former ambassador for the United States and some other State Department officials asked me to take out some of the information in my story. They were worried that I would expose the escape routes. They told me they were worried that my documentary would endanger future refugees if I released too many details about where they were traveling and what they were doing. So I ascended to some of their requests. I did delete some information from my reports, but not all of them. And I was able to say to these people from the State Department and this former ambassador, yeah, well, I'm not going to take that out of the documentary. So this gives you an example of, as a journalist, but I think in anybody doing sort of interesting work like this, you run into pressures of all kinds with any government and any powerful entity. And the difference, of course, is that in China, if I was a Chinese journalist, I would have to abide by their request or face some harsh consequences. Even with the American government, I can say to them, I'm going to do what I want. So I think that's a useful example of some of the pressures that we all will face from time to time with many different entities. So in preparation for this talk, I watched videos of previous speakers here at the Albright Institute, and some of them talked about women's leadership, and they talked about the importance of standing up for your convictions, asking questions, questioning authority, and leading. Really, what does it mean to be a leader? And I think we all know, and I know from my time here that the examples of graduates here they're really powerful role models, like Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton and Cokie Roberts and all of these fantastic women who have challenged authority and have spoken boldly in favor of the things that they believed in, pressed for change in many different parts of the world, parts of their lives. And when I was here at Wellesley and while I was in the United States, it was very clear to me how to lead. It was very clear to me what my responsibilities were as a journalist and as a human being, as a Wellesley grad. I knew what I needed to question and how, and I knew I would be rewarded for that. But in China, I have often felt very lost, very baffled, right? Do I write this article? Do I tell this story? Do I risk this person's life or that person's life or my own professional standing through reporting and doing the things that I believe in or speaking openly about some of these politically sensitive topics? So I think this is a real challenge for all of us here in this room, for educators, but also for students and Wellesley alums, is how do you push for change? How do you be a leader? Not in the United States, but how do you be a leader in China? And how do you be a leader in other parts of the world, right? We're all here because you're probably going to build a life deeply invested in and immersed in international relations. And what does it mean to lead in a place like China? Do you speak boldly and openly, or do you quietly push for nuanced change? Do you do nothing in exchange for the great experience of being there? These are questions we're all going to have to ask. And I think it's worthwhile to cite an article in the Wellesley Alumni Quarterly. It was in 1920, and Wellesley at that time announced the adoption of a little sister, Yenqing College, in the heart of China's capital. It was the women's counterpart to Peking University. And the Wellesley Alumni Quarterly wrote, "It is now provincial to think of only one country or of one civilization. In any adequate education of the present day, lines must go through all the earth and work to the end of the world. No students are more eager to be factors in worldwide cooperation than those of America." And then the Quarterly went on to describe some of the women at Yenqing, and it said, "There is scarcely a girl here who has not some serious and worthy purpose to which she wishes to devote her life. Some of the Chinese women students had started a school for the poor, while another student wielded considerable influence through her pen and contributes to Chinese newspapers and magazines all over China." The article concluded that Wellesley and Yenqing College stand shoulder to shoulder in idealism and aspiration. So I think these ideals are things we really have to think about, and I can't offer you a roadmap or a guideline. I can't answer these difficult questions for you, but really we're going to be providing the answers to those questions over the next few decades. And our leadership, I think, as Wellesley alums and just our experiences in the world will also help to shape the values of this world. And you have an equal part in that. Just as the Chinese government and the American government has set certain ideals and aspirations to strive for, you do too, and you'll be part of that shaping. So it's a real question to ask yourselves. How am I going to shape these values? What will my life stand for? What are the risks I'm going to take? How do I speak openly about the things I believe in while also being respectful of the very difficult histories, such as China, of the places that you're working in? So that's my talk, and I'm open to any questions. Sure.
Hi, thank you for the great talk, Shannon. I was working at ABC, for ABC News in Beijing at the same diplomatic compound over the summer. And one of the problems I ran into was that every day the office received calls from people whose house were forcibly relocated, yeah, or petitioners who came to Beijing to petition for injustice in the provinces. And I was told by my coworkers and my boss that there are too many of those stories and we can't report every single one of them. So my question is this: how do you choose the stories that you report? What's the criterion or values that go into your choice?
Well, I think there are a couple answers to that question. Number one is, I also do, I might battle the Chinese government on some stories, but I would say I also battle sometimes my own editors and say, this is important and this is something we need to do. And especially with American news organizations. I mean, every country and every organization has its own ideal for a story. And so you have to recognize that. So ABC News will have a certain style and topic that they film, and the BBC will do something. And so it's good to find a good fit for your stories, right? But then there's also this issue of land seizures has been going on for a long time. So it's not a new story. And if there's a way to advance that story, a way to make it different. Maybe are there more land seizures than there were before? Is there something unique about the story? So on the one hand, it's also good to advance the story in some way with some new information. But if it's something that you think is important, I think, I want to make clear in this talk that I'm not only critical of China, but that as individuals, you're going to bring your own value system to any environment you go into. So if you think it's important to report on those things, then it's probably something you should do. You may not be able to do the story for ABC News, but maybe for another news outlet. But it's also good to see the larger context and the way that you can advance the story and make it new.
With the changing leadership in China, I know that there's been more focus on kind of unveiling the corruption. Have you seen that come into play in journalism, and do you feel less pressure to censor your work with the new focus on unveiling corruption?
It's an interesting question. I'm writing an article right now on corruption, specifically in state media. And I don't know what the reaction will be to it. I think that in some ways, if you do a story and it backs up the government line, you're not really going to get in too much trouble for it. So I think that's a lot easier than if you're investigating the wealth of Chinese leaders or something like that. So you're right. There's a government line now, a crackdown on corruption. But I think the challenge is part of my article focuses on CCTV, and some of my former colleagues say that they're being unfairly targeted, and that CCTV has been being highlighted as an example. I think somebody told me that Xi Jinping has been arresting people from CCTV to send shockwaves throughout Chinese society. I don't know if that's true or not, but that, of course, if I reported it, departs from the government line a little bit. And so it's a challenge. But just like some activists know, if you stay within certain lines, you'll be okay if it backs up the government goals.
Hi, I'm Grace. So I like how you mentioned that as a reporter, your role basically is to help people by capturing their stories and showing them to the public in hopes that someone will take action to to physically help them. And I was wondering what you believe are the next steps. So after you create a documentary like the refugees from North Korea, do you target people, or not target people, but find certain people that you think will be greatly influential and send them the documentaries? Or I was just wondering what the after effects are.
Next steps are.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you can do that and try to create as large of an audience as possible for those films. As a journalist, you're somewhat restrained because you're really only supposed to be an observer. So I have to be very careful to create a boundary between me and the stories I'm reporting on, because ultimately I'm not there to help. And really, if I'm doing my job right, I'm objective. So even with some of these issues, like the petitioners in the psychiatric hospitals, I know that there are people within the government who are working to improve rule of law and trying to stop this from happening. I know that's true. I can't always include that in my story because the government's not transparent and they won't grant me an interview and tell me specifically that they're doing this, but I know that they are. So my job is, even with them, or say with the North Korean government, to also try to understand things from their perspective and understand that even though there's a real clampdown in China right now on free expression and journalists and dissent, I also know that the economy is slowing down and that the government is kind of hunkering down and preparing for this economic change. And I reserve a little bit of compassion usually for almost every actor in my story. So because I try to make my stories balanced in that way, it prevents you from trying to help specifically. But I have thought about perhaps leaving journalism and doing something that would be more directly tied to helping these individuals. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Talene. I had one question. This has come up in multiple speakers' talks now, sort of the internal ethical and moral line that you set for yourself in your career. And so I was wondering, obviously you've had this great experience to work in China and hear all of these stories, and sometimes you're censored and you have to take some elements of those stories out. And I'm sure you probably tuck them aside so that you always have sort of running tab of everything. And so I was wondering if eventually when you do leave China and you can maybe tell the stories of these people with like, full disclosure, if you would ever do that, or is it kind of a risk in implicating these stories as well, and would the people then face the consequences in China? So do you have to think about that as well?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, especially at CCTV. I kept careful notes on all of my experiences at CCTV in case I ever wanted to do that. But for now, I think that I'm using that CCTV experience to kind of inform my work in other ways. So even though I'm not directly writing about the man in Tibet who's complaining about his health care, I think the depth of that experience and other experiences like that inform, in an indirect way, informs my reporting of other stories now. So the impact of their words and even the things that I had to take out, I still know, what I saw and what I experienced in my travels during that time. And some of it was very positive, some of it less so. But I just use that knowledge. Right now I'm just using it as context for the stories I'm doing now. So, but yeah, I have careful notes and all of that. Yeah, sure.
Hi, I'm Nikita. What you said in a previous question about trying to represent all of the actors in your stories, I thought was really interesting. And oftentimes we see sort of a broad brush painted on a lot of actors, especially the Chinese government, as sort of just corrupt and not doing its job, causing a lot of harm. And I'm wondering, in your own experience, if you found that supporting the people and the government who are doing really good work in trying to move China forward, if supporting them and exposing them as good actors has been helpful, or if you even have the power to do that, or if it's something that is sort of just like undercover and we don't get to see.
I think tell me if I'm not answering your question correct or not giving you the answer that you're sort of seeking, but I think America and other European news organizations as well, everybody has their own bias. And so one of the challenges I have is talking to editors who maybe haven't lived in China and don't have a deep experience there. So for example, in the Comoros, that African country that I went to last year, I was reporting on a group of Chinese scientists who were testing a new malaria drug on the entire population. They did basically a mass drug experiment on 800,000 people. And in exchange for the experiment, the Comoros, they said, if you let us give this drug to everybody in this country, we will eradicate malaria from the Comoros, which is a big deal because in the Comoros, as many as 90% of some people in some communities there have malaria. So that's a huge gift to the country. And they did it. They tested the drug. There were some severe side effects from it. And, but they ended up eradicating malaria from the country. That's huge. But what was interesting, I thought the story was interesting because to me it wasn't a black or white issue. I think that's an issue, at least for me, I couldn't tell you whether that was wrong or right. It's unethical to test a new drug on people. But in the end result is a great gift for the people of that country. So I found in the reporting of that story sometimes some pushback from some of my editors because they said, well, we thought this was going to be a very negative story about China and Africa. And it was this lack of knowledge of kind of some of the positive impacts of China in these communities. And so I think that's sort of the thing is whether you're in China and you're sort of reporting stories that challenge the Chinese government party line, you're also challenging the assumptions and views of people here. And that's really important. And I don't think there are enough positive stories about China. I think there should be very nuanced stories about China, and probably in every other place in the world. But tackling this question of, gosh, this is so unethical, but it gets the job done, really. And that can be said about a lot of Chinese policies right now. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
I was wondering how you first connected with CCTV, and also why they wanted to hire you as a Westerner. What did they see you bringing that a Chinese person couldn't?
Yeah. I had some family ties to China. My mom had a lot of friends in China growing up, and she suggested I go to Beijing. She watched documentaries on CCTV. She knew I wanted to do documentaries abroad. So she recommended that when I was traveling to Beijing on vacation, to set up a meeting with CCTV. I had no personal contacts there, so on the internet, I found the number of a director at CCTV and documentaries, and I just called him. And he said, okay, well, just come meet with me when you land. So I met with him, and he and another man offered me a job to do what I did, which was to film documentaries across the country. So it was actually quite easy in a bizarre way. But that's how I got to China.
Is it common for other non-Chinese nationals to be working for CCTV?
At that time, they were part of this. It was part of this push for internationalization. So there had been Westerners who had been hired before me, but I was still part of a great minority within the network, and they hired me because I had previously worked as a researcher at ABC News and as a local news reporter, and they wanted to learn from me about Western techniques. So while I was there, while they allowed me this great opportunity to film documentaries, I would tell them, well, this is how we ask questions, and you should use natural sound here. And what I found, I didn't expect this to be true, but kind of what I was teaching them in that exchange was the basis of Western journalism, which is challenging authority, I would encourage, we ended up making the common man, the farmer, the star of our story, because they would usually want to start out with a government official, which is incredibly boring. And also, we don't need to give them more of a voice. They already have all of the power they need. So in a weird way, I found my job there. It's part of the incredible experience of China opening up. It was almost like I didn't intend that to be this way, but kind of teaching about some of the ideals of democracy and independent journalism. Now, of course, since then, CCTV is it's continuing to internationalize, but there are greater restrictions as well. So, yeah.
And I had a question about credibility. So your story that we watched was an extreme case of like socially and politically outing people for challenging authority and existing power structures. But as someone who does this in a less visible way, have you felt that you've personally experienced this tension between challenging what's there and also maintaining your credibility? Like in the case of these people being labeled as insane, that's a huge blow to their credibility, but also I would imagine their identity and self-worth. So I don't know, how do you navigate that, or is that not even necessarily the right question? Does credibility follow if you're true to your convictions?
You mean, did I ever question their credibility because they were being declared insane? Is that what you mean?
No, were you concerned for your own credibility? Like that other people would perceive you as less credible if you were very vocal in challenging something that isn't challenged enough?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I think so. And I think especially amongst my Chinese friends, because one of the difficult parts about being a journalist in China is you're supposed to speak openly about all of these forbidden topics. And I have a lot of Chinese friends who care a lot about their country, and American friends or Western friends who are there who really care a lot about China, and maybe they haven't seen the things that I've seen. So when I do a story like that or another story, it's just another example of a foreign correspondent showing the evil side of China. And yeah, I think I encounter that bias, and I think all I can do is say, well, this is my experience, this is what I've seen, and even if my job our job as journalists, and I think sometimes as people, is to give the weakest in our society a voice, and that's my job. So I'm not always going to be doing a positive story about China. It's more important for me to do stories about people who need help in any society. That's my rule in the United States as well. So, but yeah, you challenge these assumptions, and the people question if you're biased. And I don't know, there's no real answer for that. You end up making a lot of people mad. So, yeah, I guess.
So your career and life have clearly demonstrated the power of words in society. And I'm wondering if you ever kind of stop to think, like, what is it that I'm saying that is so destabilizing, and why are these powerful organizations and governments so afraid of what I have to report? And maybe, do you think that the governments do have reasons to be afraid of your reporting? And if you could elaborate on that.
Yeah, I think the Chinese government overreacts to reporting. It's hard to say because I don't know. I'm not an expert at keeping a country stable, so maybe they have reasons for doing what they do. But there was this great political cartoon. It was about the Hong Kong protest, and it had these little mice waving placards and an elephant sort of cowering in fear. And the mice were like, why are you afraid of us? I mean, these little pipsqueaks, right? So I think China, it's just a very insecure time right now in China. And I think they're just cracking down on anything that might destabilize the country. That's my impression. And in some ways they're right, and I think they do overreact. And they've got a tough job over the next 15 years, because in some way the country is just going to have to liberalize on some of these issues, as they have been over the last 20 years. But how they do that while keeping the country stable, I'm not sure. And but I think that they really overreact, and I think that the attitude towards foreign correspondence is very counterproductive, because when you sort of intimidate foreign correspondents, or some of my colleagues have even been hit or beaten or whatever, it's not going to inspire positive coverage of the country, right? And it's just only going to back up that line, right? So if they were just more, I think sometimes I wish that the Chinese government was a bit more self-confident, and in some ways, kind of what you fear, you create. And if they were more self-confident and more liberal and were very kind to reporters, allowed open access, that would be great, because we're going to get our stories no matter what, right? But we'll either have to go through a lot of hoops to get there, or we can get them more easily. So I think, and I wish China had that, towards some ethnic minorities, say like in Xinjiang or Tibet, some of these issues. I think if China would liberalize in some ways, like in terms of religious freedom, they wouldn't encounter so much anger from the local people. So yeah, I wonder about that, the confidence of the authorities. Yeah.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your honesty and candor, especially about the trade-offs of your work in either promoting, your own self-development as a professional and as a person, but also balancing that with like the ethical bottom line of sort of producing the truth. And I was wondering, although you said about your time at CCTV that it sort of challenged a bit of your ethical bottom line, overall it was a rewarding experience for you professionally. Was there ever a time in your career that you regret either stopping a story or revealing too much in a story, that you think the cost sort of outweighed the benefits?
It's an interesting question. Well, I think that North Korea documentary is a great example, because that was another really big ethical question, because it's very dangerous for these refugees to travel through China. And if they're caught, it could be a death sentence. And by having me, a Caucasian woman, following them around, I add danger to that journey. So, and you could say, I think it'd be fair to say that I was wrong to do that. I don't know. But I weighed on the balance that it was important to tell their stories, because I had that very unique opportunity to follow them and hear what they had experienced in North Korea. So I felt like it was a risk that I could take, and I tried to be as careful as I could. So that's one example, right? Yeah. So, yeah.
I'm Hannah.
I was wondering if you could comment on the events in France and how in the US there's been a lot of discussion about free speech and the right to free speech, and I was wondering what the reaction has been or might be in China.
You know, I don't really know because I've been in the States for the past week, and then I was in Europe before that, but it was before all of this broke out. So I haven't been in China, but I don't really know about the response to that specific event. Of course, China has this restive region, Xinjiang province, in the west part of the country, and it's been a center of protest. It's a predominantly Muslim region of China. And over the last couple of years, China has said there's a big problem with terrorism and separatism there. I think it's a complicated issue because people there sometimes say they're protesting for religious freedom and against the eradication of some aspects, the forcible eradication of some aspects of their culture. But it brings to mind the credibility of the Chinese government, and they really need, I think the government really needs to improve its credibility so that if there is a problem with terrorism in some part of the country, then it's easier to believe them. So I don't know. I don't know about the Chinese response to that specific event, but China has, in many words, said they joined the fight against terror. And they also say that some Chinese fighters have joined ISIS as well in Syria, so that's quite interesting. Yeah.
Hi, I am Maria Jose. And you mentioned that you were an independent documentary filmmaker, and I was curious to know how that works. Do you find topics for stories that you think are interesting and then talk to news companies about publishing these stories, or do news companies suggest these stories? And I was also curious to know if the North Korean refugees made it safely to Thailand.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I have a couple of contracts with CBS. I report regularly for France 24 and French media as well. And in addition to that, I'm really enjoying writing. So I'm writing more. I'm of help right now to the New York Times on a story, and I've written for The Economist earlier this year. And so what I do, sometimes they come to me with the stories that they want reported, but oftentimes I also, especially for the bigger projects, I usually have a big project that I'm working on, like on Africa or North Korea, and I pitch that idea. And it can be a really tough process because for, say, the story I reported last year in Africa, very few people have the money to send me to Africa to do it. And I have to convince people that this is a story that's important. And I really felt like that was a very important story, a very good example of Chinese investment in Africa. But I went to several news organizations. I can't even remember. I went to NPR, maybe the Atlantic Monthly. I can't remember. I mean, I jumped through so many hoops, and it can be so discouraging. But usually when I have an idea like that, I try to see it through. So that's how it works. And then in terms of North Korea, there's sort of a sad and uplifting outcomes for all three of those people. The young boy successfully was granted asylum in the United States, and he is living in Virginia with his uncle and his grandmother who previously escaped. So he's doing very well. He's in high school and learning English, and he's great. And the two women, the older one, which she was in the center of the picture, I can pull up the picture again. She is, they both of them are in South Korea, in Seoul, and that's the woman with the yellow and green dress. She's married, and I think she's doing pretty well. And then the woman in the red, I think she's back to working in prostitution. That's very common because there's a lot of prejudice in South Korea towards these North Korean refugees. So it's hard for them to find work. They're uneducated, they're older. People can tell because of the way that they speak that they're North Korean. So sometimes that's the only way they can make a living. But for her, I think a lot of it was also because it was the only life she knew. So as a woman becoming an adult from the age of 14 to 16, she was a prostitute. And she told me that when she was in that brothel in China that her captors were incredibly kind. She referred to them as her uncles. And she said that they were very kind to let her out of her room once a month. And she had a very kind of sexualized way of sort of also interacting with people. So I think she'd been really shaped by that experience, and probably in some way that confinement felt very comfortable to her. So I hope she does okay, but it was definitely an education for me in human trafficking. Yeah, sure.
Please join me in thanking